Hey,
Well,
Disha.
hello. How are
Hello.
you?
Good. And hello to the Perry Sisters
Perry
community.
Sisters. Yes, thank you for
We're,
having us. We are so excited to talk with you about weight management and all of the things that happen, during perimenopause and into menopause. And we know that this is a hot topic these days. And so we really want to be able to bust some myths and answer a lot of questions. And there are some really great questions we have tonight to be able to answer from everybody.
yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe you can kick off an introduction, Dr. Disha.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm Dr. Disha Narang. I am an endocrinologist and obesity medicine specialist. I am going to be the new director of obesity medicine at Endeavor Health with North Shore Hospitals right outside Chicago to be starting in about a week here. And my passion is women's health and weight management. And Nisha and Dr. Nisha and I do a lot of collaborations together, talking about weight management and culinary medicine. And so we are excited to do this as well.
Yeah. And I'm Dr. Nisha. It just so happens that both Disha and I have rhyming names, which is awesome. And I am also a physician. I'm board certified in obesity medicine, culinary medicine, and actually recently got my certification in menopause, which is a very, very important period of our lives, which we'll talk a little bit more about. I am the director of obesity medicine within the transplant department here in San Francisco at an academic center. And my passion really is helping my patients live their happiest, healthiest, and longest life. And I know Dr. Disha feels exactly the same way. And so we're both just so thrilled and excited to be here to talk to you about this very important topic. As Dr. Disha said, bust a lot of myths because we know that there's, plenty of not so great information out there on the internet, and it can be really confusing when you're trying to navigate it. So we hope to be a resource for all of you as you're doing that. So let's talk a little bit about, I'll let you kick it off.
Well,
Yeah.
one thing we just kind of wanted to set the tone for during this podcast is that we want to make sure that we are emphasizing that obesity and weight gain in general are chronic in nature. It is not someone's fault, and it is very much hormonally mediated. And so oftentimes, unfortunately, when society talks about this, they really view it as a disease of vanity, as a disease of someone's, doing where they ate too much and gained weight, and like now, they're a certain weight. And so the one thing we want to just sort of set the tone right from the get-go, we want to make sure that that we don't necessarily care too much about that number on the scale, while, certainly that can be of concern, and it's a measure that we use. What we really want to talk about is that when we start to gain weight, as we get into perimenopause and menopause, we're concerned about what's going on the inside metabolically. And the reason why is we're concerned about what that means from a cardiovascular standpoint, because 50% of deaths in women in the menopausal state are due to cardiovascular disease, right? And unfortunately, increased weight is very much tied to that. So we're obviously going to get into that much more in nature, and talk about kind of the background and why that happens. But I think there's some concern that people are always concerned about, like, weight and the number on the scale. And especially it's so tied to women as well. But no, we're not here. It doesn't matter to me if you're 300 pounds or 150 pounds. The fact is that metabolically, you could still be having the same level of risk for development of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And that's what we want to dive deeper into today.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that society is obsessed with thinness, especially when it comes to women. And, Dr. Disha and I are here to tell you that when it comes to the treatment of this chronic disease, we come at it really, really strongly from a health and quality of life approach. We're not really, again, looking at that number on the scale doesn't mean that, this person is healthy versus this person is not healthy. There are other risk factors and other, socioeconomic factors that we look at, we know that contribute to health, I should say. So it's just not about the number on the scale. It's really, really beyond that. And it's just so important, especially for women. We are underrepresented. We are underheard in the medical community, in the medical system. And for us to be able to have that voice with providers that we trust is really important. And so, again, right, here to bust those myths and make sure that you feel empowered to advocate for your own health. Right. Yeah, great. Yeah.
So, I was thinking maybe we should just talk a little bit about the physiology of weight gain, and then we can certainly, dive into the questions because we have several really, really good questions. And I think,
saying that, obesity is a chronic disease. And what do we mean by that? It's just like a disease like high blood pressure, heart disease, and diabetes. We know that there's actual genetic factors, biology, which works with environmental factors that are at play as far as the development of the disease. And so it's not just about, lack of willpower or personal failings that lead to weight gain. There is a whole other slew of processes that are going on, especially under somebody's actual like subconscious control. They can't just physically control it. That contribute to, to weight gain. Or specifically when we're talking about weight gain, I really want to be clear that we're talking about adiposity, which is the medical term for body fat. So you'll hear us say adiposity or adipose tissue. That is the medical term for body fat. And so we're really specifically focusing on that. And so when it comes to the chronic disease of obesity, I like to tell my patients, and I'll let Dr. Disha also explain, that, it's really a disease of the brain. There's centers in our brain that are working to regulate our appetite and our hunger. And again, a lot of it's happening under our control and beyond our control. I wish, we could control all aspects of our life, but we can't do that. And so it's something that is really genetically and biologically mediated. And unfortunately, we do live in a very, difficult food environment. And so it's hard to really navigate and find healthier options. There's a lot of convenience options in our food environment that make it really easy to eat some of the foods that maybe we're trying to be mindful of. And you take that on the background of having, a biological drive. Everyone's made a little different. Some people have more cravings than others, and that's truly biology playing a role. And unfortunately, you have an environment that is not conducive to health promoting dietary habits. It's hard for all of us, including myself. Yeah.
And, and I think that when we were talking a little bit earlier about, obesity being seen as a disease of vanity versus something that is neurohormonal, so much of this is genetically determined, right? So there's so many families, and I'm sure, you might be one of those families, or you might know people, but there will be families where, one person goes on the mom's side where people might be more overweight. The other sibling might be looking more like the dad's side where everyone's, at maybe a lower weight. And then the siblings look opposite because of that. Well, that's genetics at play, right? And in those situations, people grow up with the same kind of food, the same kind of environment, social situation. However, it's you can see sort of how genetics can play a role in this, right? Like everybody's metabolisms are set up differently from day one. And then, as Dr. Patel was saying, add in the obesogenic environment where there was a McDonald's on every corner in this country, and there we have, a perfect storm to increase weight. And so when we have that, not only does, it become easier to put weight on because we live in that environment, our genetics are just the foundation of it. So truly, even in your clinic, when patients come in, they've been dealing with weight issues for years, right? They've dealt with every diet. They've tried every, diet in the book. And that's why they're here, in a doctor's office, really trying to address this. And so it's not a disease of willpower. And it's not one of those things where, oh, I ate too much and I gained this much weight, so I just need to stop eating or change what I'm eating and then I'm going to be fine. Well, in certain situations, yes, you might be able to lose some weight by changing what you're eating. But at some point, what happens is that those hormones do take over. So our hunger and fullness is very much determined by hormones, and our bodies are set up in different ways in terms of how those hormones, correspond to our brain and our stomach. And so, again, like, I just want to emphasize that it's not a disease of willpower at all. And so, as we get more into this, there's really great therapeutics and things like that. And that's, that's going to be a different podcast that we do, but we have mechanisms around this, and they actually work with the hormones. And that's kind of how we are able to reach successful weight loss, longer term these days. But again, it's, add on kind of, those changing things and like our genetics and our food environment, and then add perimenopause and menopause onto that, right? And so all of a sudden our estradiol levels are way low, our testosterone levels are higher, our body fat distribution changes, right? And so so it may not be someone who's been dealing with weight issues their whole lives, but it might be someone who's had perfectly normal weight their whole life, and then, hey, age 45, age 50 hit, and all of a sudden I'm 20 pounds heavier, and so this is, again, very much hormonally mediated. And so much of what we do is to try to either slow that down or to help, at least mitigate that process.
Yeah. And I think it's important for individuals to understand that where we store that adipose tissue, and for anyone that's joined later, I'm using the term adiposity or adipose tissue because that is a medical term for body fat. So where we store the adipose tissue is very, very important when it comes to talking about what's called metabolic health. And we had a question about insulin resistance, for instance. So individuals that tend to store their adipose tissue more in their central abdomen, especially when it's either right next to some of these really key organs like our liver or our pancreas, they tend to fare metabolically worse than individuals that tend to store their adipose tissue in what's called subcutaneous depots, or kind of around the hips and the thighs. So what happens to women when they're transitioning into menopause, because their estradiol or their estrogen is going low, they start to develop a redistribution of that adipose tissue from their subcutaneous depots, so the hips and the thighs, into their central abdomen. And it's unfortunately, not something that we can really stop. There hasn't been strong evidence that even, starting estrogen replace or hormone therapy can really help with that process. So that's not an indication for hormone therapy at this time, but it does happen. It happens to all of us. And so many of our patients are women. And as they're transitioning into menopause, they see these changes and they often wonder, well, what am I doing wrong? And I just want to be really clear with you that you're not doing anything wrong. Unfortunately, this is, again, biology. It's going to happen to Dr. Disha. It's going to happen to me. And it's not something that, you're doing to yourself, because that's really, really, I think we get really hard on ourselves and we're like, we just need to go and kick it at the gym more, or like just start eating salads every day. And this is just the inevitable changes that are happening because of what's happening to our bodies. The other thing that is really a big change in what's called body composition is that we lose lean muscle mass. And muscle mass is really, really important because we want to, it's a big determinant of our metabolic rate, or kind of our metabolism, I should say. It helps prevent, frailty. It helps with longevity, keeping as much muscle as possible with longevity. There's a lot of reasons to have muscle on board, but unfortunately, we also see those changes. So there's an unfavorable dip, or unfavorable tip, I should say, in body composition, where you are gaining more adipose tissue around your abdomen. You're also losing muscle mass. And you couple that with the horrible symptoms that women, face when they're transitioning into menopause. And unfortunately, some women experience what's called vasomotor symptoms, or hot flashes, a lot, pretty frequently. And it can start earlier on, it can start later, it can start, at any point during that transition or after. Every woman's very different, our biologies are different. But those changes can really make it more difficult for individuals to manage their weight, because let's say they're not sleeping as much because they're up at night with all of these horrible hot flashes, and they're having to change their t-shirt all the time. It's really, really challenging, because we also know that sleep disturbance can make it more difficult for individuals to manage their weight, because again, hormones. So let's talk about, what happens. So your hunger hormone, actually, when you're sleep deprived, goes up, or the activity of it is more stronger, I should say. And you are starting to, eat more during the day when you're sleep deprived. You also crave more carbohydrates, or like refined sugar containing foods, or like the really, tasty foods that like we really, really enjoy eating, all of us. So, there are actual physiologic changes or biology that's happening to women during that transition. And it's really not, like, I really want to emphasize, it's not your fault. Like, it's not in your head. Like, these things are happening.
And I think, unfortunately, so many women are seen, by any doctor, with these sorts of symptoms, potentially weight gain, with hot flashes, the other symptoms of perimenopause and menopause. And they're often told, well, this is just part of life, right? Deal with it. And we're here to say, and I think so many of the other menopause and perimenopause advocates are really taking a stand against that, right? I think one of our missions is to make sure that you have the tools to be able to take that next step, and the knowledge and the education behind why something is happening, so that you can be the best advocate as possible when you are being seen, by the doctor, so that you're getting optimized care. Because, as Dr. Nisha said, it's oftentimes women are sort of, pushed to the wayside, or we sort of compromise our own health while we're taking care of others. And we come into care later on in life. It's never too late to address these health issues. However, it's also important to start to become an advocate of your own health, especially as we do age. And unfortunately, chronic disease happens with increased age. While increased age is certainly a blessing, with it obviously can come various issues. And so, when we talk about this, getting into one of the questions that somebody had asked from the Peri Sisterhood, is insulin resistance something that needs to be on our radar in perimenopause? And the answer is yes. And the reason why, and Dr. Nisha had just mentioned this earlier, was that our body fat stores change, right? And so many of us are sort of dealing with that increase in body fat around the stomach area, where potentially that may not have been before. But that's kind of where that insulin resistance kind of starts. The fact that our muscles are breaking down and we have more fat stores, that increases insulin resistance. And so going back to what she just said a minute ago, it becomes that much more important to maintain regular exercise, especially resistance exercise. We don't want to be losing muscle that then, turns to fat and then increases insulin resistance. And we start this whole cascade of, increasing our risk of developing prediabetes and diabetes after that. So it really starts there. And, it's never too late or never too early to start looking at this a little bit further. And truly, exercise is just such an important part of this, even though you may have been, eating healthy your whole life. Because of these changes in our hormones and the changes in our fat stores, that alone will increase our insulin resistance. And that's kind of what we are able to sort of combat as we, really emphasize increased resistance exercise and cardio.
And the other thing to note, as you're transitioning into menopause, a lot of individuals just, again, they don't feel good. And so they may not feel like increasing their physical activity, or perhaps they were able to, exercise to a certain level prior to, going through perimenopause, or prior to having these really severe symptoms. And now they're not able to do that type of activity anymore because you're feeling really crummy, right? And, that happens, right? Like when you get sick, you don't feel like exercising. When you're having hot flashes and you just don't feel very well, your mood is low because you're going through all of these changes, you don't feel like exercising. And so we really, really cannot emphasize how important it is for women to, or all individuals for that matter, everyone, to exercise, because it is a protective factor from a lot of these what we call cardiometabolic diseases. So that's, obesity, heart disease, diabetes. And so it's very, very important. And so just remembering that, when you're going through these changes, that any activity is better than nothing.
Is good. Yeah.
Is better than nothing. So I remind myself of that. I'm just to be completely open with all of you. I'm postpartum. I'm 6 weeks postpartum right now. And it's been, I've had many changes in my body, and I also don't feel like exercising the way I used to, but I'm doing what I can, and it's what I can do right now. And I'm giving myself some grace. So yeah. I hope that you can do the same for yourselves.
And oftentimes I'll tell my patients, there's no expectation to go and run a marathon tomorrow. There's nothing like that. Nope. But if that means that maybe, do you have 5 minutes to get a walk in? Do you think that maybe you can do that twice a day, potentially 3 times a day? Well, that's 15 minutes extra of exercise that you're doing this week that you weren't doing last week. right? Like, do you think you can put some ankle weights on, for example, while you're climbing the steps at work? Can you take 10 minutes or whatever at the lunch hour to go and take a quick walk and come back? So every little bit counts. The other thing I'll often tell my patients is that, let's make our workspace conducive towards movement as well, right? So many people are now working from home, since the pandemic and all of that. Think about, a walking pad while you're on Zoom calls. Think about, pacing the floor while you're on a call or something, stand while you're, typing or have a standing desk, little things like that. It may not feel like a lot, but potentially for someone who doesn't have the time, and they have a busy job or a busy schedule, to fit those kinds of things in, little changes like that actually do add up and can add some of that cardio and resistance that you may have been missing previously.
And I just want to address a question or comment that's in the section, because I think it is really, again, thank you, Michelle, for chipping in and giving us your background and telling us a little bit more about yourself. So we completely understand that it's really frustrating when you're doing all of these things and, maybe the central adiposity, the midsection weight isn't budging, or that girth isn't budging, and we completely understand that. And so we will be talking about what can be done, as far as treatment options for that, especially in the next podcast that we're recording.
All is not lost.
All is not lost. Yeah. And it's, again, not your fault. You're doing everything you can. And, Dr. Disha and I, again, like to celebrate all the victories that our patients are experiencing in even, improvements of quality of life outside of changes in their weight. Maybe their clothes are fitting differently. Maybe they can now, run after their grandchildren. Now they can do this activity that they couldn't do before. So, we understand that the frustration is there. And again, it's not your fault. And you know what? Kudos and hats off to you, Michelle, for doing all of those things, because it is hard. It is hard to do that in our society when we are so busy. And
even though you might not necessarily be seeing it visually, your body on the inside is probably thanking you right now. So even that little bit is probably improving your insulin sensitivity
and inflammation, chronic disease risk. I mean,
so it's not in vain. And, we recommend do not change that, right? Sometimes what I'll tell my patients, and everybody's obviously individual, but, like, are there ways to potentially increase resistance while you're doing that? Like up the ante a little bit, increase intervals a little bit, because if you're doing 30 minutes of walking on top of all of that, you're doing literally everything you can. And so we were going to definitely be talking about this more, in the next podcast episode. So please stay tuned. We wanted to kind of make this episode a lot more about what's going on our insides. And then we're going to do the second one as to, what are we going to do to fix this all? So.
And Dr. Disha and I are on this journey with all of you. Like, we are also on this journey, right? We're not, immune to the same, just because we're doctors doesn't make us immune to the diseases and health concerns that everyone else, our patients, face. And so it's really important for us to practice what we preach, and we're doing it with you. And it's frustrating sometimes, and we understand. Yeah. So let's see. So one of the other questions is, what can those in early peri do to reduce the impact of hormonal weight gain? And so I would say, when it comes to the treatment, which we'll go into just very briefly, there's lifestyle factors that are combined with medications. And we'll say that most of our patients do need a combination, with the medications to help them.
The sweet sauce is when both get married, right? And so, we don't want to necessarily say you have to only do lifestyle, and if you do lifestyle, it's a failure of, if you don't lose weight with lifestyle, then it's a failure, and then you have to start medication. That's not true at all. Lifestyle, per the studies, may allow, and this is in the best case scenario, about 6% long-term weight loss, which is not that much. And so, some of the therapeutics that we have now, when we combine the two together, well, that's where we really start to see long-term success.
Yeah. And okay, look, there are some people out there that are biologically or genetically, and I'm going to call them, I don't want to say lucky, because they're doing the work too, but they have a propensity to really be more responsive to lifestyle changes. And so there are going to be, you're going to have friends or family in your community who's going to tell you, or maybe they'll share their experience with you and say, well, I just did X, Y, and Z diet and increased my activity to X, Y, and Z. And then I, lost 50 pounds. Those people are probably more the exception. Yeah, the minority. They are the minority, I should say, at least in our clinical experience, than the rule. Because most of our patients, again, like Dr. Disha said, they come to us.
They've tried everything in the book.
Successful human beings and individuals in their communities, their careers, and they've just been made to feel like they're failures when it comes to a number on the scale, because that's what society did. Maybe another doctor or healthcare provider made them feel that way. And this is where, we do a lot of undoing of, negative thoughts and emotions for our patients, because that's how they've been made to feel that this is their
And I think a lot of people start to develop, or they maybe have had this for a while, but a toxic relationship with food as well. And one of our goals is sort of to undo that and make sure that you have a positive relationship with food, in that you actually enjoy what you are eating, right? So much of our lives are tied into what we eat. It's a social thing. It's, it brings our families together. And that's something that's like a constant in our lives. And so we don't necessarily want to demonize food. And that's why, these sorts of very restrictive diets tend to be really hard on people. And I think that messes with them long term. And the reason why is that it's because they're hard to sustain long term as well. And so a lot of what we do is to try to kind of sway people from that a little bit and undo some of that as well, because it's a long journey, right? If we spend half of our lives in menopause, having that kind of relationship with food is no fun. That's kind of my 2 cents there. And we just spend a lot of time talking about that and figuring out, well, how do we navigate the food environment?
Yeah. And I'll go back to what I said earlier for anyone that missed it. There is true biology at play. So there's, people that have more cravings for specific types of food, and that's something that's coming from the brain, and it's not like you can just control it. Sure, I'm not saying that there's no control ever. Like we all have agency in our own health, right? We all want to wear seatbelts, wear a helmet when you're like out there riding a bike, like, don't smoke or drink excessively. There's a lot of things that we can do to prevent complications or health complications, right? But then again, when it comes to the chronic disease of obesity or gaining excess adiposity, there's a lot that's out of our control. And that's the reality. But again, this is where medications, which Dr. Disha and I are going to talk about later, really come into play to help offset those changes so that you can, really live your happiest, healthiest, longest life and work on those lifestyle changes.
And the other thing, and this is why I think, the sisterhood is so important. There have been so many comments and questions about, well, I'm doing everything possible, but I gained this weight and nothing's changing in terms of my weight, no matter, diet and activity. You are not alone, right? This is such a shared experience, between all of us women. And so that's the other thing, right? Like there's zero, validity to kind of be shamed for this, because this is so neurohormonally mediated. And this is just, I'm seeing this a lot kind of in our chat and like the comments that have come through. And it's a very, very shared experience. And that's exactly why we want to be able to talk through this a little bit. The one other question, and just because we were talking about food, I just want to skip to this question. Is keto or higher fat diet the only way to address midlife middle? This person doesn't want to go back into diet culture, but is very upset about, just an expanding midsection. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So no, it's not the only way to address. So, in our experience, we have patients that have tried the keto diet. If you're not familiar with the keto diet, I'll just quickly say it's a it's a form of low carb diet that's to the kind of the extreme, where you're eating less than 5% of carbohydrates in a day.
I also just want to chime in. We need carbohydrates to survive. Our cells need glucose in order to survive. And so the way that our society and our culture demonizes carbs, that carbs are bad, it's really, really important to start to walk away from that, because that's not benefiting anybody. And there's so much guilt tied into it that like, oh, I ate a carb, or, this is going to just derail me or something like that. No, carbs are not the enemy here. We need carbs to survive. But what is important is that we need to be able to start talking about what are the healthy carbs, right?
Yeah. Quality of the carbs really matter. Like the quality of the carb containing foods, right? So with Dr. Disha, I'm going to take her example. An apple and a Snickers bar are not the same thing, right? We know that because an apple is a whole food. It has fiber in it, it has vitamins and minerals. The way that our body will kind of break it down and quote unquote process it is going to be different than, a Snickers bar, especially when we're talking about blood glucose control and insulin. And so, it's really the quality that matters. I eat lots of carbs, and that's okay. They're fiber rich carbs, whole grains. Do I also eat other types of carbs? Of course I do. I mean, we're all human at the end of the day. But you don't have to do a keto diet. In our experience, many of our patients that have been on a keto diet have not found the approach sustainable in the long term. What almost always ends up happening is that they can sustain it for maybe, I don't know, 3 or at the most 6 months. And then something happens, whether it's a life event, or they're just like really tired of eating the same things over and over again. They're experiencing kind of adverse effects like GI side effects from, really eating that high fat diet. And what most people kind of end up doing when they're on the keto diet is they're eating a lot of what's called saturated fat. So they're eating, really fattier fats than meat or cheese or butter, which, when you're actually transitioning into menopause, I really want to make this very clear is that, women's heart disease risk really increases during that time. And if you're somebody that's at risk of heart disease and you're really, pounding on the saturated fat and increase your LDL cholesterol, that could further accelerate your risk of heart disease. And so we know that LDL cholesterol goes up
with keto
during that transition. Yeah. Especially with keto diet. So couple those two things together, you're we would be worried about, individuals with that heart disease risk, and especially if they're doing this diet. So, no, there's not, first off, any one size fits all approach we work with our patients in all different approaches. That doesn't mean that, outside of keto, a lower carb dietary pattern couldn't be health promoting. That's totally, a lot of patients like to eat lower carbs, and maybe they'll eat healthier quality fats and healthier sources of protein. That can still fit within, somebody's lifestyle, and we support that. But we just know in our experience, the keto diet specifically is not like some magic bullet for, losing weight during menopause. It could potentially increase your heart disease risk.
I'd also recommend, for my patients who, I will tell you, I think pretty much all my patients have probably tried keto. And I'll often tell people, if this is something that you can see yourself doing 20 years from now, then great, go for it. But here's the thing, like, again, as I said before, we need carbs to survive. And, people start to miss those things. And then what happens is that after you deprive yourself for a certain amount of time, what happens? That craving goes way up for the other stuff. So then we go to the other extreme often, and that may not be always the case, right? That's obviously there's just some people do that, some people don't. But truly, you want to think about what is the way I can eat long-term, like for the next 25 years of my life or whatever that might be, and still be satisfied and still feels fulfilled and still feel like I'm doing a good job from a health standpoint. Because again, like restriction often is difficult to sustain. And the other is that, really cutting back on calories and things like that, or trying to go, a really low calorie diet, that sort of thing. Again, really tough to sustain. And the reason why that's important is that what happens, again, this is happening with our brain and our stomachs, right? Our hormones. So when we restrict our diets for a while, sure, you might lose weight in that first few months of doing that. But what happens as you are losing that weight, that hunger hormone level is going way up. And so what you're craving, it starts to go up again. And that's what leads to the yo-yo dieting. Because the second you drop that 50 pounds or, whatever that might be, your body is rearing to get back into what it was at that more comfortable state 50 pounds ago. So when the body is rearing to go do that, our hunger hormone goes up, right? And so our cravings go up and our desire to eat other things goes up. And then there goes our weight, right? And so this is where we start to see the up and down, up and down. And this is precisely where therapeutics can be helpful, because it does help to suppress that hunger hormone, whereas diet can only go so far in terms of helping to suppress the hormones. And in fact, it doesn't really suppress the hormones. It makes the hormones go the other way. And so that's where, you know, it's important to kind of be mindful about, like, what am I choosing to eat and how am I choosing to eat? Because this is why it's really tough to restrict everything and then add on, you know, the increased testosterone levels, decreased estradiol levels, and just sort of that perimenopausal transition. And we've got the perfect storm to either not lose weight or actually gain weight.
Yeah. And I think number 6 and number 4, we have questions that we got from all of you. So we're making sure we want to answer them. So one of the questions that we got was, what foods should I start avoiding and what should I increase? And so again, there's no one size fits all dietary pattern that is like the gold standard or like the mecca for weight loss. But what we do know is that there's some general principles that we can all work on to start incorporating more health promoting foods, because those do tend to be more filling, they're lower in calorie. And so when we talk about those, it's really lean protein. So these are foods that are not, you know, that are protein rich, that don't have a bunch of like it's not fattier cuts of meat. It's not, you know, they don't have a lot of other excess calories attached to it, I should say. Also fruits and vegetables, of course, whole grains, which is a healthier form of carbohydrate. So that's, you know, whole wheat bread, if you're eating bread, because that's going to have more fiber in it. You know, things like quinoa or other whole grains out there. I really like buckwheat noodles. You know, if you're into whole wheat pastas, there's legumes, which is, you know, thinking of lentils and beans, that's what that category falls into. And so these are all really like satiating foods that we want to incorporate more of to kind of crowd out some of the other foods that maybe we're trying to be more mindful of. I really like the 80-20 rule. I don't know what you think, Dr. Disha, like it's, you know, what you eat 80 to 90% of the time matters more than what you're eating 10 to 20% of the time. So when you think about 100 meals that you have, like in a month, for instance, what 80 to 90% of or 80 to 90 meals looks like, it's better than the 10 meals. And I don't like the word cheat meals. A lot of my patients use that term, or people use that term. But, you know, if you're out and about and you have something that's a little out of the normal for you, I don't want you to feel guilty about it. Remember, it's that consistency that's really important. Yeah. Trying to find ways to incorporate some of these more health promoting foods. You know, nuts and seeds are also very health promoting. Of course, nuts are calorie dense, but, you know, the portion size we're mindful of, but again, very full of healthy fats, other vitamins and minerals. Really focusing on trying to get more of these foods in. And protein does actually become really important in weight management because protein is satiating. We also want to make sure that we're working on preserving as much, again, of that lean muscle mass, especially as people transition into menopause. Like I said earlier, we're losing lean muscle mass. We want to make sure we do that combined with that resistance training. And so protein does become important. And I always tell my patients that, you know, we really want to aim to try to have some form of lean protein with every meal or snack. I personally, anecdotally, when I eat more protein, I feel more fuller and I actually crave less. So that's just my experience.
And,
but I do see that
about combining it with a high fiber meal,
yeah.
like food as well. So when we eat protein and fiber together, and that fiber can come through vegetables and fruits, it can also come through grains. You know, like whatever that might be, oatmeal, quinoa, barley, farro, like any of those kinds of grains, whole grains. When we pair that with a protein, that makes us fuller faster. And so, you know, sometimes I think people also go overboard on the protein, but it's important to kind of maintain if you're, especially with weight loss, you want to go between like 30 to 45 grams of protein per meal. And you can kind of, you know, divide that up accordingly. But, you know, I think like sometimes people do go overboard with all the protein powders and supplements and things like that. You don't really have to do all that. If you're eating sort of a kind of a healthy diet, you should be able to get that through regular foods, whether that might be animal-based.
I think Dr. Disha's screen might have frozen, but what she was saying is that there's different sources of protein, whether that be lean proteins from animal sources, if that's within your dietary pattern, or and plant sources. And I would recommend combining, definitely getting a lot of those plant sources in too, which are really health promoting as well because of vitamins, minerals, and fibers. I think, like we said, trying to get it from whole foods as much as possible. A supplement here and there is probably fine, but we're not saying go and buy tubs of protein powder and just start chugging it at every meal. That's not what we're saying. But we do think, I have a lot of patients that, will do a very filling kind of meal replacement protein shake when they're on the go, especially, which I think is really helpful. But again, trying to get it from the whole foods so that you can feel satiated and full. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry. I think
now you can. Okay.
Yeah. And so I just finished your sentence.
Yeah, no, you said exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
And one of the questions was, best macronutrients to follow. And truly, I really don't talk to my patients about macronutrients. Because truthfully, if you're following sort of a kind of a healthy whole food diet, you should be able to meet those requirements pretty well. And so I think, getting into the nitty gritty of that sometimes actually is more anxiety provoking than not. And I usually, sure we could, depending on case by case basis, we can talk about that, but I usually try not to emphasize that because I think people get really stressed out thinking about, oh, did I meet my macro requirement or whatever, and I feel like that kind of drives us in sort of the direction I wouldn't recommend going.
Yeah, a lot of my patients don't count macros. Or like they don't really, follow that form of kind of a dietary pattern, just like, like fitting X amount of carbs, X amount of fat, X amount of protein. I think that it can be really cumbersome, like Dr. Disha mentioned, and it could feel really restrictive. Which it's hard. Again, you kind of fall into that, it's like an all or none with the restriction. Either you're doing it or you're not doing it. There's no middle ground. And so I don't tell my patients to count macros. If somebody really, really finds it helpful, like they come to us, which would be probably the rarity. I haven't actually had a patient recently do that. And they really, really are working with this and they're responding to it and they love it and they don't find it cumbersome and they have a healthy relationship with food. We support our patients in what works for them and what's health promoting and really help them and guide them. So sure, in that situation, it could be okay, but most patients don't. Yeah. I don't know. And I think even just going back to, I think one of the things that I always tell my patients when they're starting off on this journey, maybe they want to work on weight management, improving their health, really understanding kind of what they're eating and how they can make changes. And I do think that a short amount of tracking can be really helpful for patients, just to not track calories, not count calories per se, unless somebody really finds that very useful. Which again is a rarity in my patient population, but really to understand what they're eating so that they can think about, well, how can I swap out this pasta with this other pasta? Or like, hey, I already make this, baked chicken. So now I can maybe add some more vegetables on the side, or maybe I can make this baked chicken or this chicken dish in a more healthier way. So this is where like the culinary medicine part of our training comes in, because we can really help our patients think about ways to tweak what they're currently eating to help improve their diet quality and their health outcomes. So
and what we've found, and this may or may not be the case depending on who we might be talking to, but there are lots and lots of questions. How do we eat? What do we eat? How do we put it together? And so much of that can affect our long-term health. And so we do spend a lot of our time talking through that. And this may or may not be the right forum to do that. It might be a completely different episode as well. But I think so much of that is tied to, how do we manage our long-term weight? How do we manage our long-term risk of developing diabetes and heart disease? And we have evidence to show that, for example, with the Mediterranean diet, there was a 25% reduction in cardiovascular mortality, right? Like eating in that manner can save your life. And so in the current environment that we live in, where it is so promoting of, eating all the processed foods and sort of a lot of junk, and convenience type foods, we have to really be able to kind of really keep our heads down, go through it, avoid all that noise, and make sure that we are optimizing our own health and our family's health. Obviously that falls downstream from that, but that's where we start, right? Obviously all the hormones and like changes and all of that, we can't necessarily change, but we certainly have therapeutics now, that can help that. Hormone replacement therapy is a wonderful resource, obviously, to help with all the other symptoms of menopause. There's not necessarily too much association with weight gain and weight loss with hormone replacement therapy. It's also, a fraction of what like a birth control pill would be as well, right? So, and so it's not like, giving you hormone replacement therapy is all of a sudden going to make your weight journey easier or harder. It should really be a neutral thing. And so when we can take care of that part, then we can start to address, all right, well, what are we going to do about making sure that we can decrease all of that fatty tissue, the visceral adiposity, and how can we help to improve, the muscle mass? How can we, help to kind of decrease all that insulin resistance that may have been happening, or at least to prevent it. So lots of things happening here, right? But I think step one is that we need to kind of make sure that we're sort of looking at this in a very systematic way.
Yeah. And I like what Dr. Disha said, that, sure, like we don't want to take, hormone therapy is not indicated for weight loss. That's not an indication. Any evidence-based doctor or provider is not going to prescribe it for that reason. But if you're having hot flashes and they are keeping you up at night and they are making it more difficult for you to exercise and they are affecting your quality of life,
it's all tied together.
Please talk to your doctor or healthcare provider on whether or not hormone therapy would be a good option for you, because I do think that we underutilize it. Unfortunately, only a fraction of individuals that are good candidates for are on it. And we're just all suffering unnecessarily through these horrible symptoms that many of you are experiencing. And so it's really important to get those symptoms under control. Another thing I wanted to mention is that, it's a really important habit. A really important thing to think about is like how incredibly important is consistency. Sorry, I couldn't get my words out. Consistency when it comes to habits and consistency when it comes to your eating patterns. Again, thinking of the 80-90% rule, when individuals are swinging one way or the other, it becomes very, very, very cumbersome. You get, deterred because I always hear the words like falling off the wagon. And I'm like, no, you're not, the wagon is on its own path, and it's, it's going to be a curvy path. It's not going to be this like, one side or the other path. And so it's just really important to understand that consistency is very, very important, and consistency above perfection. Like, don't beat yourself up and don't try to be perfect. None of us are.
The other thing I also just want to make sure, because I think that sometimes there tends to be a confusion when we talk about cardiovascular disease and obesity, or just weight gain. And so the reason why we care about this is because increased weight, of course, is tied to insulin resistance, which can increase the risk of prediabetes and diabetes. Diabetes is a coronary disease equivalent, which means that diabetes and heart disease are sort of looked at on the same level, right? And so increasing weight can increase the risk of things like heart attack, stroke, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, of course. And so that's why, from our standpoint, we are fixated on weight gain, weight loss, weight management, right? Again, it's not about the number on the scale, but it's very much that what risk factors are we establishing when we do have a significant weight gain. And then add all the, physiological changes with perimenopause and menopause. How do we start to mitigate that, as we do age? And so that's why we care about this. And so it's not just that yes, we gain some weight and we have, you know, potentially increased belly fat and that sort of thing. But 10 years down the road, what does that mean from a metabolic health standpoint?
Yeah. I know we're coming up on time, so I want to make sure we answer all these other questions. And so what is the best way to maintain weight loss after it's achieved? So this is a really good question. So I always tell my patients that, you know, weight loss is hard. Long-term weight maintenance is harder. And I don't mean that to, you know, deter them or make them feel bad, but it's to really understand, again, that there are processes that, again, like Dr. Disha said earlier, as you're losing weight, your hunger hormone increases, your basal metabolic rate goes down. So these are processes that are actually, and I'll use the word fighting weight loss, because your body doesn't want to lose weight. And that's just what it's doing. It's defending the weight that you were at previously by trying to make it harder to lose additional weight. Now, this is where, even with medications, when individuals are at a happy, healthy weight, we have to maintain that weight loss long-term. And one of the most important things for long-term weight loss maintenance is exercise, specifically aerobic exercise. So we have a study, or we know that based on what's called the National Weight Control Registry, this is a kind of a long-term study of individuals that have been able to maintain, you know, a significant amount of weight with actually lifestyle factors alone. We know one of the most like successful habits that they have is that they're exercising 60 minutes of aerobic activity on most days of the week. So this is where the exercise becomes incredibly important for weight management. We know that if individuals, let's say, don't change their diet, aren't sleeping really well, if they just increase their activity, they're really not going to see a robust weight loss. Not saying that exercise is not important when you're trying to lose weight. It's very, very important, but it becomes incredibly important when you're trying to maintain that weight. And that's why the consistency of habits becomes really important, right? Because what we've all seen it, you know, or some of you are ourselves have experienced when we've tried to lose weight in the past for whatever reason. If it's really extreme, it's going to come back on once you stop doing what you're doing. Right. So that's why finding that approach that works for you is important.
Yeah. There was an interesting question here in the chat, which I've tried to answer, but I think it's important for everybody to hear it.
Yeah.
Someone asked, does this ever get better after postmenopause? Will it be easier to lose weight once you're in postmenopause? And I think that, you know, the answer here is consistency. Because, you know, postmenopause, it's not like all of a sudden our hormones go back up and our estradiol levels are, you know, back up and our testosterone, it doesn't really work that way, right? And so I think one of the things to remember is that, you know, starting these habits earlier on, especially in perimenopause, that's what's going to guarantee health, you know, in the years beyond as well. And so, you know, while it may not necessarily be easier to lose weight, that consistency and sustainability is your key to long-term success.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one thing maybe we didn't mention and we should mention is that when it comes to health improvement, so let's say, you know, reducing the risk of developing diabetes if you have pre-diabetes, or, you know, reducing your triglycerides if that's elevated, or, you know, if you have what's called metabolic associated liver disease, also previously termed fatty liver disease, or heart disease risk, you know, we're really seeing some of those changes starting at as little as 3 to 5% of total body weight loss. Now, for other things like heart disease risk, it's really kind of more at the 10 to 15% of total body weight loss, but we're not talking about, you know, somebody losing half their body weight or like 40% of their body weight. We really start, especially in blood sugar, like diabetes, or elevated blood glucose and insulin resistance is really responsive to weight reduction. Even just
any level of weight reduction.
Yeah, exactly. So it is like, you know, really, we see patients that don't have to take insulin anymore because they've, you know, lost enough weight and they can be off of insulin, and now they're just on, you know, oral medications or pill medications, or not on medications at all. That happens too. So, you know, we're not talking about getting bikini body ready or whatever those stupid magazines that are at the grocery store when you're standing in the checkout line. And it's especially right now, just, you know,
almost January 1st, you know, everyone's stressed about this. Yeah.
Everyone's gonna, you know, there's gonna be magazines that they say like, get slim quick, or like how did X, Y, and Z celebrity lose, all this weight. And it is really refreshing to see even like, public figures coming out and saying like, look, I've dealt with this my entire life, and like medications have really helped me combined with lifestyle changes, right? It's both of those are really important. Not saying that everyone that we take care of is on medications, but
it's not a failure of lifestyle management to be on it. And the reason why is that if potentially, and we're obviously going to talk about this in the next installment, but the reason why is that if we can control it with, your lifestyle, of course, but then also a medication, well, that prevents the risk of diabetes, the risk of heart disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, sleep apnea, joint disease, potentially, the list goes on. And so it has long-term implications. And so, unfortunately, we live in a society where it's like, damned if you do, damned if you don't, because, you're shamed for being a certain weight, but then, if you get help for your weight, then you're a failure because you're on medication. Like, you just can't win. And, at some point, you just kind of have to shut that out and focus on my health and my well-being and my long-term, consequences of being in a certain, making certain choices about that. And so that is like, I think it's so important to just shut that out, because there's just, again, society so much emphasizes that, hey, this was your fault. And this is, you look like this or you look like that. Who cares, right? We want to make sure that you're living your longest life, that you're being as healthy as possible. And the important part is that also transcends to your children. It transcends to the rest of your family. And everybody benefits. And so, especially again, because women always get the short end of the stick, right? We want to make sure that we are emphasizing that more than anything. You don't need to be a size 2. Yeah, like it's
no. And it's just, again, this is why what Dr. Disha and I do is so different from what, individuals have grown up experiencing, especially, in the 90s with all the diet culture. And I won't mention any names of the programs out there, but there's a lot of, a lot of that, unfortunately, ingrained in us. And we've brought that with us well into adulthood and into our later years. And it's time to,
unfortunately, there's lots of programs and like things that are preying on people's desperation to lose weight. And, I think it's really, really important to make sure that you are going about this in a safe manner from people who practice evidence-based medicine.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we got 1 minute left.
Yeah, we've got 1 minute left. Any other burning questions? I know we didn't get to all the questions today, but I think, I hope this was helpful to everybody. And of course, if there are more questions, we're also happy to answer that in the next podcast episode as well.
And we just want you to know, no matter where you are in your stage of life and what habits you're trying to work on, we're really proud of you, because it's not easy. I'm saying that right now again, 6 weeks postpartum, guys. So it's not easy, but we're really proud of you. And, every little bit counts. So don't give up.
Yeah. And again, consistency and sustainability. There is no magic pill. There is no magic diet. This is all hormones, and we are here to tackle those. So
yeah. Awesome.
All right. Any other questions? We've got, yeah, I don't think we have any more questions.
Yeah, and definitely we'll dive into more treatment. I know
we have a lot more to say
on the treatment, because there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
And so make sure that you submit your questions for that. And because I know that there will be a lot. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, great.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining tonight. We really appreciate your time. Okay. Bye. Bye.